Dinner at my father's house, plates of roast meat and glasses of red wine. Miles, my fiancé, and I had barely begun to feel any joy when my father set down his knife, looked straight at me, and said, "Avery, holding your wedding in a park is an insult to our family's standing." I stayed silent, feeling each word slice into my skin. Brian, my brother, smirked. "Is this a wedding or a picnic?" "Avery, you're ruining the family's reputation." They returned the invitation and refused to attend. But one day later, they regretted it, because the wedding had been featured in the most prestigious newspaper in the United States. Before I go on with the story, where are you watching from? Leave a comment below and don't forget to like and subscribe so I can tell you the whole truth. I am Avery, 29 years old, living in Columbus, Ohio, working for an environmental nonprofit. I grew up in a middle-class family in Upper Arlington, a place where social reputation was valued above feelings. My mother, Elizabeth, was the warmest woman I have ever known. She loved flowers, cherished quiet afternoons in the garden, and always taught me that living true to yourself mattered more than any praise or criticism. When I was 15, she died from a rare illness, leaving a void that nothing could ever fill. From that day on, my father, Charles, the CEO of a major real estate company specializing in luxury housing developments, became stricter than ever, as if he had to preserve the image of a perfect family to make up for his personal loss. My brother, Brian, worked with my father and believed that everything should be done to reinforce the brand of the family. I, on the other hand, chose a different path. Simple, close to nature, and far from glittering parties. Miles, the man I love, is a high school art teacher who delights in the rustic and shares with me the joy found in little things, like watching the sunset by the Scioto River. I still remember, as a child, my mother once told me about her dream of an outdoor wedding, a ceremony in the garden, with the sound of wind and the scent of fresh earth after rain. She had planned to hold her own wedding in our backyard, but my father flatly refused, afraid it would tarnish the family's reputation. From that moment, that dream etched itself into my mind. Many years later, when Miles proposed, I knew I wouldn't choose a lavish banquet hall, but would instead fulfill my mother's unfinished dream, a wedding close to nature, where every detail truly meant something. When Miles and I began planning our outdoor wedding in a corner of Scioto Park, it started with quiet afternoons at our small kitchen table, sunlight spilling through the window, sketching out each detail together. We chose slightly textured recycled paper for the invitations, each tucked with a pressed wild daisy inside the envelope as a small message about the ceremony's meaning. I carefully handwrote every guest's name, while Miles drew soft floral borders around the edges. For attire, I suggested an ivory linen dress, light and with pockets, so I could move easily beneath the trees, while Miles would wear a white shirt and beige khakis, formal enough, yet harmonious with the natural setting. We even talked about hanging pastel glass lanterns we would make ourselves and setting up a linen canopy in case of light rain. Every idea made me feel closer to my mother, as if she were smiling and listening. But that joy was quickly tested one weekend evening when we went to my father's house in Dublin. The dining room gleamed under the chandelier, the long wooden table laid out with roast meat and red wine, yet the air felt strangely cold. My father set down his knife, looking straight at me. "Avery, I hear you're planning to hold your wedding in a park?" I nodded, smiling as I explained about the wild daisies, the glass lanterns, and the wooden chairs borrowed from neighbors. But his smile vanished. "Do you realize that would be an embarrassment to the company's image?" His voice hardened. He went on to say that, given our family's standing, a wedding should be held somewhere prestigious like the Hilton Columbus downtown, where business partners could be invited and face preserved. I stayed silent, feeling each word slice into my dream. At that moment, Brian, my brother, leaned his elbow on the table, smirking. Have you thought about the consequences? A wedding like this will look like nothing more than a picnic. People will talk. They'll ask why Charles's daughter would do such a thing. You're ruining the family's reputation, Avery. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and reproach, as if I'd just made an irredeemable mistake. Miles, sitting beside me, squeezed my hand under the table, as if to remind me we weren't alone. But right then, I understood that the road to our wedding would not be only flowers and candles, but lined with scrutinizing eyes from my own blood. 2 days after dinner at my father's house, I had just left the office when my phone buzzed nonstop. It was Brian. His voice was low and urgent, with no preamble. "I'm calling to tell you, Dad's really angry, and this time, I don't think he'll let it go." I quietly asked, "Not let it go? What do you mean?" Brian paused for a few seconds, then lowered his voice. "Avery, you know what Dad's like. If you keep insisting on having the wedding that way, he'll consider you as cutting yourself off from the family. Don't expect him to call, to visit, or even show up at anything ever again. Mom's gone. If you let this happen, don't think the family will ever be the same." I stood on the sidewalk, watching cars stream by under yellow streetlights, feeling an invisible cord tighten slowly around my chest. Brian continued, "I don't want this to happen, but I can't change how Dad thinks. Think carefully. Are you ready to lose everything over a wedding idea?" I didn't answer right away. In my mind, I saw my mother standing in a field of daisies, telling me that love must be tied to truth and joy, not to the approval of others. Finally, I simply said, "I know what I'm doing, Brian." And before he could reply, I hung up, letting the city noise swallow the silence between us. A week after the call with Brian, Miles and I finished the last of the wedding invitations. They were nestled in pale beige envelopes, each holding a pressed wild daisy wrapped in thin paper, as if cradling a memory. I sent one envelope to my father's house in Dublin, addressing it in my neatest handwriting, a gesture to show that, despite our differences, I still wanted him there. 3 days later, when I opened the mailbox in front of my house, a familiar envelope lay atop a pile of advertisements. My heart froze when I saw it was the very invitation I had sent, intact, except for a folded sheet of paper inside. On it, in bold letters, were the words, "Don't disgrace the family." No signature, but I recognized my father's rushed handwriting on the back, a sign of anger simmering hot. I stood in the yard, late autumn wind making the dry daisy tremble, and in that moment, I felt as though he was not just returning the invitation, but rejecting the chance to step into the most important part of my life. When I told Miles, he said nothing, only wrapped his arms around me from behind. "We're still gonna have our wedding our way," he whispered, and I knew that, even in rejection, the ceremony would not lose its meaning. After the invitation was returned, I knew for certain my father would not change his mind. But instead of backing down, Miles and I became even more determined. In the evenings after work, we turned our small kitchen into a workshop. He cut linen into light panels for the canopy, while I painstakingly hemmed the edges. Old glass jars were painted in pastel tones, drilled and threaded with wire to hang as lanterns. Sarah, a close colleague, came over to help, bringing a whole basket of wild daisies picked from the banks of the Scioto, joking that your mom would want to pack an extra bunch to decorate heaven. On dry days, we set up the canopy frame in the park using leftover planks from a nearby carpentry shop to make long tables for guests. A friend of Miles volunteered his small sound system, and the neighbors lent us several sets of wooden chairs. Each item, no matter how small, carried the quiet support of people who didn't care about reputation, only about our real happiness. One afternoon, as I placed a small photo of my mother, inside a simple wooden frame, on the ceremony table, sunlight streamed through the oak branches and lit up her face, making me feel as if she were there, smiling at me. In that moment, I knew I was preparing not just for a wedding, but for a promise to myself. To live true, to love true, regardless of judgment. Amid all the preparations, I set aside a few weekend afternoons to make my wedding dress, not the flowing tulle or glittering gowns in the high-end boutiques downtown, but an ivory linen dress, light and soft, just as my mother had once envisioned. Miles's mother and I cut each piece of fabric together, sewing every seam by hand. She had skillful hands, each stitch precise and secure, as if she were sewing blessings into the cloth. Along the sleeve cuffs and hem, I embroidered small pale yellow daisies, my mother's favorite flower. Miles often stopped by our makeshift sewing room in the living room, watching me and his mother whispering as we worked, smiling as if he understood this was more than a dress. It was a piece of memory I was piecing back together. I decided to add 2 hidden pockets inside, to hold a few important things: my mother's old handkerchief and a slip of paper with the words she once told me. Choose what makes you feel at peace, even if the whole world disagrees. The day I tried the dress on for the first time, standing before the mirror, I saw not a glamorous bride from a wedding magazine, but someone full of quiet confidence, true to herself. I knew that when I walked under the oaks at Kyoto, I would be carrying my mother with me. That morning, Columbus greeted us with a clear blue sky and a gentle breeze carrying the scent of freshly cut grass. Miles and I arrived at Kyoto Park early, when dew still clung to the wild daisies we had planted days before. Sarah and a few friends were already there, hanging the pastel glass lanterns from the great oak branches, the sunlight filtering through their frosted paint to bathe the space in soft hues. The borrowed wooden chairs were lined neatly, each with a fresh daisy tied in linen ribbon. The long tables in the corner were ready, with golden toasted bread laid on banana leaves, the aroma mingling with the earthy scent of damp soil. A friend of Miles tuned his acoustic guitar, strumming warm chords that blended with birdsong. I walked to the ceremony table, placing my mother's framed photo in just the right spot, adjusting the angle so the morning light fell across her face. In that moment, I breathed deeply, feeling each heartbeat, nervous yet calm, as though all the weeks of preparation had been leading me exactly where I belonged. As guests began arriving, laughter and conversation wove into the rustle of leaves, and I knew that even without my father and Brian, this would be a complete day. Our day. Once everyone was seated, the guitar began to play its opening chords, as soft as wind moving through oak leaves. I walked slowly along the aisle strewn with golden leaves, my linen dress swaying lightly, the faint scent of wild daisies mingling with the damp, woodsy air. My eyes fixed on Miles, standing there in his white shirt and beige khakis, exactly as we had imagined. But what caught in my throat was his smile, steady, peaceful, as if to say I had chosen the right path. At the altar, light filtered through the pastel lanterns, spilling across my mother's photograph so that her face seemed present among us. Miles's musician friend paused to tell a short story about a love rooted in nature, inspired by our walks along the river. Then we turned to each other and read our vows. I spoke of how he made me believe that love didn't need to be proven with lavish parties, but in evenings spent on the porch watching sunsets or tending a small plant together. Miles said that since meeting me, he'd learned that home wasn't a place, but a person. His voice faltered when he spoke of wanting to live in a way that would make my mother proud, wherever she was. As we exchanged rings, a sudden breeze shook loose the daisy petals, letting them drift around our feet. Applause broke out, and my vision blurred, not just from joy, but from knowing I had kept a promise to my mother. A week after the wedding, as life began to settle back into its rhythm, Miles brought out his old camcorder in the living room. We sat together on the sofa, opening the laptop to watch the clips he had recorded. There were no cinematic angles or stage lighting, just honest moments. Me tucking a daisy into my hair before the mirror, Miles fumbling for words in his vows, Sarah laughing as she retied a chair ribbon, and everyone breaking bread together. passing it along banana leaves, a custom we'd borrowed from an international food fair in Columbus to reduce waste and keep the celebration close to nature. I picked the most touching scenes, stitched them into a 4-minute video, and added a short caption. A day of love, nature, and memory. I sent it to a friend at the Columbus Dispatch, thinking they might enjoy seeing a simple park wedding. But 2 days later, that friend messaged, "Avery, your video's on the homepage." I opened it to see the headline, "The Midwest's Most Beautiful Outdoor Wedding, Love and Sustainability." Within 24 hours, it had been shared across Ohio community groups, then picked up by a national Green Living magazine. A local blogger wrote, "This Columbus wedding proves that love needs no extravagance." The comments overflowed with congratulations, praise for its simplicity and meaning, and special mention of the tribute to my mother. I was moved, but also uneasy, knowing it was only a matter of time before my father and Brian saw it. That moment came sooner than I expected. The next morning, as soon as I walked into the office, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. First came a voicemail from Brian, his voice rushed and slightly unsettled. "Avery, your wedding video's everywhere. Why didn't you say it?" "Look this beautiful?" "Dad's getting asked why the family wasn't there. I don't know what to tell them." Before I could finish listening, a text popped up from my mother's sister, Marlene. "Just saw your wedding video on Facebook. It's wonderful, Avery. I didn't know it was yours." I smiled faintly, but the smile faded when I saw my father's message. Just one line. "Was this wedding one you didn't invite me to?" I sat still for a moment, then replied that he had been invited, but chose not to come. Less than a minute later, he wrote back, "Business partners are asking why the family wasn't there. Do you understand what this does?" I stared at the screen, realizing that even after seeing what the day had been, his focus was still on the company's image, not his daughter's happiness. That evening he called, this time asking to meet in person to see the full video and understand the story. I agreed, knowing that meeting would be about more than a film. It would be about the distance between us that had stretched for years. We met at a small studio in German Village, where one of Miles's friends worked. The room was dim, lit only by the projector aimed at a white wall, the faint scent of roasted coffee in the air. My father arrived on time, wearing a gray suit, his tie knotted tight, his walk as rigid as if entering a boardroom. He sat down, arms folded, his face unreadable. I pressed play. The light from the projector flickered across his features as the images unfolded. Me walking beneath the oak trees, my linen dress swaying, pastel lanterns dancing in the breeze, Miles's voice trembling as he read his vows, guests laughing around the long tables, my mother's photograph glowing in the morning light. I glanced over to see his jaw tighten, then suddenly, his hand brushed at his eye so quickly it might have been to adjust his glasses. At the end, as I slipped the ring onto Miles's hand and the daisy petals fell around us, he let out a quiet sigh. "It looks like something your mother would have liked," he said, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it. I answered slowly, "I did this for her, and for myself, not to gain your approval." He didn't respond, only looked at me for a long moment before standing. At the door, he paused, his eyes flickering with something unsaid, but in the end, he left in silence. As the door closed, I knew I had touched a tender place in him, but I also knew that if change came, it would not come quickly. After the meeting in German Village, the relationship between my father, Brian, and me remained taut, like a cord with no knot to loosen it. Family holidays passed in my absence, or if Miles and I did attend, we stayed less than an hour before leaving. That Christmas, as the family gathered around the dinner table, my father suddenly turned to Miles and said, his voice flat, "Teaching art in high school isn't exactly a career with a future, you know?" Brian gave a short laugh, adding, "Exactly. You could be doing something more worthy." The air froze. I set my glass down, looked straight at them. If you can't respect my husband's work, then consider that you've lost a daughter and you've lost a sister. Miles placed his hand lightly on my shoulder, but my mind was already made up. We stood, left the table, the sound of cutlery against plates fading behind us like a faraway echo. Stepping out of that house, I didn't feel I had lost anything. Rather, I felt I was keeping the one thing that mattered most: respect for myself and for the man I love. In the winter night silence, I felt as if my mother were walking beside me, her hand resting gently on my shoulder, warm, steady, and sure. One afternoon in March, when the last snow had melted into damp streaks along the sidewalk, I opened my mailbox to find a small parcel with no sender's name. Inside, wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine, was an old photograph. I recognized it instantly. It was from my 15th birthday, when my mother was still alive. In it, she and I stood in the backyard among wild daisies, her arm around my shoulder, her smile radiant. On the back, in the familiar but now shaky handwriting, were the words, "I forgot how much your mother loved you. Now I see it." I sat still, my fingers tracing the ink, feeling as though an invisible distance had just narrowed, if only slightly. Memories rushed back. When I was in elementary school, my mother helped me build a miniature garden from clay and twigs for a science fair, adding small potted cacti around it so the judges can see how beautiful nature really is. In high school, when I suggested holding the spring dance outdoors instead of in the gym, she was the only one to defend the idea to the parents' committee, saying, "They'll remember the sunset and the smell of grass more than fluorescent lights." Those images, that voice, reminded me why I had never been willing to compromise for something foreign to my heart, and why the wedding at Kyoto had been my only possible choice. I knew the gift was for my father, but I didn't call him. Instead, I placed the photo into our wedding album, right after the picture of Miles and me dancing beneath string lights, beside a vase of daisies. To me, it wasn't just a photo. It was a sign that, despite the heaviness of the past, there were still cracks where light could get in. 6 months after receiving my father's parcel, as Columbus summer ripened with afternoons scented of lavender and humming with cicadas, I opened the mailbox to find a cream-colored envelope addressed to me in a familiar, slanted hand. Inside was a long, handwritten letter from Brian. He began with an apology, more direct than I'd ever heard. "I was wrong to take Dad's side without hearing you out. I thought I was protecting the family, but in truth, I was only protecting an image Dad forced on both of us." Brian wrote that he had just resigned from the real estate company, his job since graduating arranged by my father, accepted because he believed it was the only path. But in reality, he had always dreamed of working in fashion design, since his college days when he sewed hoodies for friends. He wrote, "I've spent too many years living for Dad, and the result was losing my sister. If you still have the patience to give me a chance, I'd like to meet and talk. This time, from my real heart." I read the letter 3 times, and in each line I saw a different Brian, less guarded, less cold, and a little like the brother who once snuck me out to fish in the park when Dad was in meetings. That weekend I texted him, "Small cafe near Kyoto, Saturday, 3 p.m. His reply was just a smiling face, simple, but enough for me to know this was the start of a new chapter for us. On Saturday afternoon, the small cafe near Kyoto Park was awash in the soft gold light of summer. I arrived early, choosing a table on the patio where I could see the trees casting shadows over the river. Within 5 minutes Brian appeared, not in his usual business suit, but in a pale blue linen shirt, carrying a canvas tote, looking lighter somehow. He smiled, a little hesitant, then set the bag down and pulled out a small box wrapped in craft paper. "I made this not for anyone else but for you," he said. Inside was a light cream scarf, its border embroidered with pale yellow daisies. He told me he had stitched it himself as a way of apologizing for not standing by me when I needed it most. We ordered coffee, and the conversation lasted nearly 2 hours. Not arguments like before, but fragments of memory. Him watching me from behind the fence at my soccer games, the fishing trips we took when Dad wasn't home, and the dreams we both once thought impossible. As the sun began to set, Brian looked straight at me. "I don't expect you to forget everything, but I hope you'll believe I'm trying to be the brother Mom would be proud of." I smiled and said, "I believe you. And I think Mom does too." Leaving the cafe, we walked together to the park, stopping at the corner where Miles and I had been married. The river breeze was soft, and in that moment, I felt the distance between us had been filled with something more lasting than any image or reputation: truth. A year after our wedding, when autumn once again gilded the leaves along the Scioto River, Miles and I returned to that corner of the park, carrying a basket of toasted bread and a bundle of wild daisies. We spread a small blanket under the oak tree, where the pastel lanterns had hung that day. Miles sliced bread while I placed flowers into a recycled glass jar, simple details that had become our own language. In our wedding album at home, the photo of Miles and me, dancing beneath the lights, still sits beside the picture of me at 15 with my mother, and now alongside the daisy-embroidered scarf Brian gave me. My father still hasn't spoken the word sorry, but sometimes he sends short messages to check in, and I choose to answer calmly, without expectation, without resentment. I've learned I cannot change the past, but I can decide not to let it bind the future. When the autumn wind carried the scent of daisies, I closed my eyes, picturing my mother here, smiling at me, Miles, and Brian, each of us living true to ourselves. I realized that wedding day had been more than a special occasion. It had been the milestone where I chose my own path, no matter who might call it shameful. And the most beautiful part is this: I would choose it again and again, as long as I could live among people who love me not for an image, but for who I really am. This is the story of the wedding my family once called shameful, yet it became one of the most beautiful memories of my life. I learned that reputation doesn't nourish love, but honesty and respect do. And you? If you found yourself in a moment when no one around you believed in your choice, would you compromise or follow the voice of your heart? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I truly want to hear your story. And if this one touched you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you won't miss the next story. Because who knows, maybe yours will be the one I tell in another video.